Good evening, and please feel free to enter those who are still coming inside. Welcome. My name is Greg Mullins. I'm Academic Dean and Dean of the Library here at Evergreen, and it's a great pleasure to welcome to Evergreen Professor Dean Spade. Before introducing Dean, I just want to thank some people who've made tonight's event possible. I'm very grateful to the Communications Building staff and to the staff in electronic media who are making this event happen both in this space and in a virtual life and in a virtual space. I'd like to thank Miranda Mellis, chief organizer of the event, and her program Literary Arts Toolkit, one of the sponsors. We also have in the audience Coordinated Studies programs Written Artifice, as well as Political Economy and Social Movements. Tonight's talk is part of the Coming Together lecture series, for which we're grateful to the Office of the President and also the academic deans provided support. The library provided financial support for Professor Spade's visit through the Daniel Evans reading series. This is an endowed fund that's part of the Evergreen State College Foundation. Nancy and Buster Alvord initiated that endowment in 2009 in honor of Governor Evans, Evergreen's second president, with the intention of bringing nationally prominent speakers to campus. The fund is growing thanks to the generosity of members of the community who would like to increase the frequency of events, just like this we're having now, and opportunities to join in that support are accessible via the libraries and the foundation's homepages. Dean Spade is professor of law at Seattle University Law School, a scholar activist, a public intellectual, and founder of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a nonprofit law collective that provides legal services to transgender, intersex, and gender nonconforming people who are low income and/or people of color. I've been wanting for several years to introduce Dean Spade to Evergreen and vice versa, because Dean's work resonates so strongly with work sustained on our campuses. The visit is particularly apt at this time, when Washington State is witnessing efforts to unravel legal protections for transgender and gender-diverse people. In this last winter's legislative session, the state Senate narrowly defeated, by a one-vote margin, an effort to introduce discrimination into the state's law against discrimination. The effort was to reverse protections for transgender people to enjoy equal access in public accommodations, including restrooms and locker rooms, that have been in place for a decade. As the law stands today, all people in Washington state have the right to access public restrooms and locker rooms consistent with the gender they live in and know themselves to be. This law has been in place for a decade, which raises the question, who would wish to reverse protections against discrimination? Why target transgender people, and why now? The effort to change the state's anti-discrimination law is part of a national effort, and we might very well see an initiative placed on November's ballot asking the people of Washington state to do what the state Senate refused to do, to limit the ability of a portion of the state's population to use public toilets, and to thereby restrict the ability of that population to attend school, work, shop, engage in political and civic life, and simply go about the practice of living. In addition to asking why target transgender people and why now, we can ask another question. Why use the law toward these aims? Dean Spade's work helps us with all these questions and pushes us yet further. Why is the law insufficient for a truly transformative project of trans politics? Why have 10 years of protections on the books not eliminated harassment, discrimination, and the violence trans and gender diverse people, and especially trans people of color, experience daily? In short, what are the limits of the law? In pursuit of these questions, Professor Spade has published widely in both popular and scholarly venues, including the influential book, Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law, currently in a new edition from Duke University Press. In addition to print publications, Dean Spade produces videos, maintains an active presence on the internet and on social media, and lectures widely. Dean's work helps us understand trans politics, not merely as an effort to secure equal rights under the law, but rather as a face-to-face encounter with the apparatus of state security, for example in prisons and at international borders, and with the political economy of race, racism, and inequality. Dean Spade's work has inspired many including me, to a more precise appreciation of the challenges we face and of the directions we need to go. Please join me in welcoming to Evergreen, Dean Spade.
Thanks. I think that's good. Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really grateful to Greg and Miranda for bringing me and all the co-sponsors and the awesome tech people who've made all of this happen so precisely. Yeah, it's a fun time to talk about these topics. I have very high regard for Evergreen, like extremely high regard. All the students I've ever engaged with from this school have had a lot of critical capacity. And been really curious and engaged and alive. And so I aimed this talk high. And if you guys want to go, if there's any concepts that feel like I skipped over steps, we can just totally go back during Q&A and like discuss any pieces. I kind of I'm going to some where my curiosities are right now, but obviously it doesn't necessarily mean that you've like been on all the same trajectories your whole life as me. So it's okay if you are coming from a different trajectory and want to figure out like, wait, why did I just make that assumption or whatever? So I kind of went with it, but just for my own pleasure and because I'm excited about you all. But I'm totally happy to like go to any part of it. But before I move on, I want to say that Talcott Broadhead drew this image. It's something we collaborated on, and Talcott used to work here, so it is part of the Olympia community, so maybe you all know that. Thought it'd be fun to name that. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is kind of about this mainstreaming moment we're in on two topics, two things I didn't know would mainstream during my lifetime. There's a mainstreaming moment happening around trans politics, and there's a mainstreaming moment happening around like criminal justice reform, right? The idea that something's wrong with policing or punishment and something needs to change. Those ideas both have mainstreamed. And I want to talk about the limits and pitfalls and problems with mainstreaming, like what happens when something you work on and care about mainstreams, and how we can evaluate some of the potential reforms that come up. And to do that, I've just to kind of get us started, I've included this photo. I don't know if people ever hang out in Seattle and have seen these stickers that are being circulated by the police in Seattle. Seattle Police Department has created these safe place stickers and asked like businesses like bars and restaurants and stuff to like put them in their windows all over Seattle. And the idea is that if you have this sticker in your window and somebody comes in because they're experiencing an anti-LGBTQ crime, they'll call the cops for you. That makes it a safe place. And so, obviously, hopefully you know that I don't think that's safe. It's a really interesting moment of watching a form of mainstreaming. Something else, another term we might use is pinkwashing, right? When a very oppressive, harmful institution tries to use an emptied out version of queer politics as a PR stunt for itself, but queer people don't get anything out of it, you know? Like this is an example of that. So this is an example of kind of like the harms of mainstreaming that I just thought was a nice visual to begin our conversation. Okay, so a few things about mainstreaming. So mainstreaming, Caitlyn Jenner, okay, done. You know what I'm talking about. Caitlyn Jenner is an example of this. So mainstreaming comes with a few things. I'm just going to go through this fast, but we can come back to talking about the limits of mainstreaming. Mainstreaming often means new forms of visibility, right? Suddenly you see images. There's like a flood of trans images in media. Hopefully that's familiar to you. So we get new forms of visibility that often come with some kind of conditional acceptance. One way that I think about this is obviously like, oh, if you have Caitlyn Jenner and she's going to like meet every white feminine beauty norm on the cover of Vanity Fair, now I can bear trans people. They're not disgusting to me for 5 seconds, right? That kind of like, it's a very conditional form of acceptance that's very limited. One way that I think about this is, like current polls say that people in the United States are like, they are more accepting of gay and lesbian people than they used to be. There's this idea that like now people are more accepting. So there was a mainstreaming process that put forward images of gay and lesbian people that were more aligned with white norms and with certain class norms and certain norms about sexuality, monogamy, and marriage that made there be something digestible that people could feel acceptance of, but it doesn't mean they actually are more or less homophobic or transphobic to the range of actual queer and trans experience. People self-narrate this. So one of the things we can talk about mainstreaming is like you get a new kind of acceptance. Like in the United States, most people think like I'm not homophobic and I'm not racist, and yet like the actual mechanisms of like racialized and sexualized and gendered distribution of wealth, well-being, harm, and death haven't been disrupted, but people think that they like these people now. So like what happens when a mainstream image gets circulated? So what that usually means is that you get a deployment of deserving figures, right? In the moment of mainstreaming. It's like, oh, I can bear to think about like a white trans teenager who needs to go to the bathroom in their school, but I still don't want to think about a trans woman sharing the bathroom at the bus station with me, and I want to call the cops on her. You know, like that kind of, right, the differences there. So you get this deployment of deserving figures. We get cast as hardworking, as professionals, as parents, as things that are tolerable, as citizens, right? And there's always an underside, right? The underside to citizen is the immigrant. The underside to hardworking is usually some kind of like anti-poor, anti-welfare, anti-black stereotype, right? The underside to like independent and professional is usually some kind of like ableist framework that says it's not okay to have interdependency, right? So all of these deployments of these deserving figures are deployments that reproduce existing harmful norms and keep the same people vulnerable who've been vulnerable. And then the next thing that happens is you get recuperative reform proposals. This is what a lot of them are going to be talking about today. So you get reform proposals that recuperate harmful institutions. But the harm and violence actually continues. So you don't get an actual disruption of harm and violence, but you get reform proposals that recuperate harmful institutions that are being targeted or being criticized by social movements. So for example, right, like there's a huge Black Lives Matter movement that's looking at the racism, specifically the anti-Black racism of criminal punishment systems, and what we see is like a range of reform proposals that would kind of clean up the criminal system without changing it at all, right? Like, or make it seem as if something's been done, right? I'll talk more about that recuperation. Some examples of problematic mainstream reforms that have been critiqued a lot, just to kind of like, you know, refresh this critique or perhaps introduce it depending on how much you've thought about this before or gotten a chance to read about it. One that's commonly talked about, right? Hate crime laws, right? So these are laws that are passed that either add punishing power if I chose to attack you based on like a protected category like your race or religion or gender, or they also sometimes include like more money for local law enforcement, and they also sometimes include certain types of data gathering, right? So hate crime laws have been critiqued because, you know, the idea that like trans people experience a lot of violence, so we should fight for hate crime laws, that's, you know, a very popular kind of image, and it produces the idea that the police and punishment systems are there to protect trans people, when in reality the largest source of violence for trans people is those very systems. So it's unlikely that we think that expanding them is going to produce greater safety. You know, hate crime laws have no proven deterrence value. People don't like look in the law books and see what the punishment is before they have the reactions that lead to violence against trans people. And they don't save our lives, right? They just add more capacity to the criminal punishment system, which will inevitably point that capacity at the same populations it always points it at. So that's kind of a kind of classic example of a reform that builds and sustains and recuperates the criminal punishment system. It makes the criminal punishment system be able to say, we're here to protect trans people. Meanwhile, it continues to be a thing that kills trans people, right? But trans people get like nothing out of it. Anti-discrimination measures, another example of this, right? We've had 4 or 5 decades of anti-discrimination measures on the books in the United States. Meanwhile, the racial wealth divide has expanded. So there's a range of reasons, and we can talk about this more if you want, that they don't work, that low-wage workers can't prove discrimination in courts. The way you have to prove discrimination in courts is almost impossible, right? You have to have like a smoking gun memo that says like, dear so-and-so, we will not give you this apartment or we will not give you this job because of your race, which like that people don't have that. Also, the discrimination framework thinks about us as individuals. So it's like, oh, there's a bad racist out there, and then there's like a victim of racial bias, and that bad type of person is that bad idea in their head. We have to find them and punish them. It's almost impossible to find them under these kinds of laws. And then it ignores like entirely systemic frameworks, like the fact that entire populations don't have access to clean air or food justice, or that their schools are worse, is not something you can find like one bad person who's in charge of, right? So it makes systemic racism impossible to get at, and instead creates a pretense that we all live on a level playing field, and then there's these few bad racists out there, right? So it actually sustains and maintains racialized systems of maldistribution in the name of like this kind of scapegoat framework. So whatever, anti-discrimination laws don't work, we know, because we haven't seen a redistribution of wealth, housing, education, et cetera, in the period that they've been on the books for the people they're supposed to cover. So those are examples of like problematic mainstream reforms that I hope make sense. Anti-bullying measures, those are basically just hate crimes laws inside schools. They've enhanced the capacity of school punishment programs to target students of color, which is what they do. They haven't reduced or made safer schools. They just are like a punitive framework for thinking about kids. Criminalization of domestic violence, there's a huge literature on this. Maybe some people have read the book, The Color of Violence. If you haven't read the book, The Color of Violence, I really recommend it. It's an amazing anthology edited by Insight. But the criminalization of domestic violence is another example where you had like a feminist social movement that names domestic violence as violence, right? And says this is not okay. And then you have a criminal punishment regime that's building and growing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and says, oh, we'll fund domestic violence work if it's focused on enhancing punishment for people who do it. And so then you get, a pretty significant racial divide amongst feminists, where white feminists were more likely to feel like the cops and a criminal punishment regime was a way to go, and women of color feminists, indigenous feminists saying, actually, that system is not going to protect us, that's not going to support our communities, we don't feel comfortable calling the cops will come and they'll deport us, they'll arrest all of us, all of those things. And so you get the kind of development of what people call carceral feminism, right? Like an enhanced criminal punishment regime in the name of women, so that today prosecutors' offices are like, their big PR is like, we're here to protect women. We're here to stop sexual violence. When of course, like sexual violence happens at the hands of the police and inside correction systems, perhaps more than anywhere else, and inside immigration enforcement systems. And criminalizing domestic violence has increased the presence of people of color in prison, but has not gotten to the root causes of domestic violence, which is endemic in our society. Body cameras for police, right? This is like the immediate response to the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement was we need body cameras for police as a reform that'll like fix this. But of course, we already know that even when we have footage of cops killing people, doesn't seem to make a difference. And the footage that is taken when cops have body cameras is primarily used against defendants, right? So again, it's not going to work. Another classic one, let's have trans cops, let's have trans corrections officers. Hope that you guys can see through that one. And another one that's really popular right now is the idea, like, we'll have relief just for nonviolent offenders, right? Like the kind of creation of a deserving and undeserving population, ignoring the fact that the entire way the criminal punishment regime works is that particular populations are more likely to be listed and named as violent, that certain groups are charged up and other groups are charged down by prosecutors and police, that the law can change at any time to make something that was not considered a violent crime, that's an arbitrary framework, right? So also that poverty is violence, that having people be forced to be homeless is violence. But that kind of framework around producing like a kind of deserving population in order to justify like the further extreme punishment of whoever is considered undeserving. And we can predict who will be in the undeserving populations. So the pitfalls of reform, the basics, right? When it doesn't actually provide any relief, right? Like hate crimes laws, when you're like, people in my community are being murdered a lot, are being beaten a lot, are facing all this danger, and we're given this reform that will actually not stop that at all, right? Like the number one thing that would ensure greater safety for trans people who are targeted is housing, right? If people had safe places to live and didn't have to be doing dangerous work outside or be struggling to find a place to go, there'd be a lot less murder of trans people, right? But that's not the reform we're offered. We're offered more money for the police, right? So no material relief or no reduction in harm is the biggest pitfall. Like it sucks when you get the law change and then you don't see the change in your lives. Another danger is oftentimes the relief only reaches the least marginalized. So some kind of relief that's designed that like only the least marginalized of the marginalized, people call this creaming, like only the top, you like skim off the top set of people maybe can get something. So like, for example, with anti-discrimination law regimes, the only people who can ever prove discrimination in employment, it's very hard to do, but it's if you work somewhere that has a very elaborate record of evaluations and has like where you have a lot of documentation. Like if you just don't get hired at a retail store later today, you'll never be able to prove that it was because of a quality you had that they were discriminating. Like how do you prove that? Or you don't get an apartment, even though all the discrimination testing shows that's all happening. You can't prove it when it happens to you. So it's only often like the most kind of higher paid and franchised employees who can like get that access, right? And in general, there's lots of different social movements that have critiqued the ways in which most rights are rights you have to pay for, right? Like you only have your right to free speech is relational to like how much media you can buy, how much media space you can buy, right? Your right to your access, your right, any of your rights are often relational to whether or not you can afford a lawyer, whether or not you can afford a court system, whether or not all these pieces. So just kind of typically a lot of these reforms, if they reach anyone, they just reach the kind of upper crust of the group. Another danger is that reforms can produce just window dressing for existing systems, right? Or legitimization of harmful systems and institutions. So the cops are like, hey, we're LGBT friendly, Tinkers doesn't reach root causes, right? So we'll add a body camera to all the cops, but it doesn't change at all. Like the numbers of cops on the streets, how they determine who's suspicious, that they exist to enforce white supremacy. And then, of course, the danger that reforms will expand harmful systems. So hate crimes laws are an easy example of this, right? That they produce, that they actually just enhance a system that we're trying to dismantle. And finally, another pitfall of reforms is that they divide people into deserving and undeserving. An example of this for me that's really obvious is like Obama's recent executive action on immigration, right? He made his big speech. He was like, we're going to deport felons, not families. So he articulated like, who are good immigrants? Good immigrants are people and families who've never had any contact with the criminal punishment system. In the same law where he produced this minor kind of deferred action plan for a set of people, he enhanced the kinds of crimes that can make you more deportable. So there's a new category now called significant misdemeanor. So they're enhancing what kinds of small things you can have been busted for that could lead to these major immigration consequences, while they carve off this like tiny set of deserving people. So with the one hand, they expand the border system, while the other hand they say we're saving these like the good ones, right? And then inevitably, which immigrants are likely to have not had contact with the criminal punishment system? Richer immigrants, whiter immigrants, all that stuff, right? So we already know who's more likely to fall into the families category. Okay, so I am interested in thinking about these questions of reform through what I'm calling in this slide a warfare frame. I teach, part of this talk has developed out of teaching my law and social movements class, which I teach every year, but I'm teaching it this semester, and I just was thinking about things differently. And there's a lot of different social movements that have articulated the relationship between the United States and various marginalized populations as one of warfare, right? So and one of genocide. So at one document that comes to mind is "We Charge Genocide," the petition to the United Nations from 1951. Do you guys ever read that here? It's a really amazing thing to read. You can find it on the internet. It was written by a number of people, but some of the famous people are like W.B. Du Bois and William Patterson and Paul Robeson. They delivered it to the UN in 1951. They were like, the United States government tried to stop them. Their passports were taken away. It was, wild story. But this document, it documented that the relationship between the United States and Black people was one of genocide, and it used the international definition of genocide and like went through like everything from like lynching to like the kinds of conditions people lived in housing to all of it. So that's kind of an example of this. Also, I think about like 1960s and 70s movements, Black Panther Party, Young Lords, the American Indian Movement, all articulate this analysis of a relationship between the United States and racialized populations as one of warfare. Contemporary analysis of the war on terror has, a lot of people have talked about like the war on terror is actually like a war on Muslim people, a war on immigrants, a war on South Asian and Arab people, et cetera. I think in many ways, even Black Lives Matter uses some of these frameworks that like juxtapose the United States government and Black people in a way that we can understand their warfare framework. In any case, people who do this thinking, often one of the things they point to is the fact that the United States uses counterinsurgency to respond to social movements, right? So there are two pieces to counterinsurgency strategies, repression and recuperation. So repression, right, like obviously we can think about COINTELPRO and the long history of the FBI's war on social movements in the United States and the contemporary realities, right? Like, Black Lives Matter chapters all over the country are under surveillance by the federal government and kind of all the broad-based activities of the government towards social movements that are pushing back around white supremacy, settler colonialism, that are the government's approach is a counterinsurgency approach, right, of repression. And the other piece is recuperation, right? So repression is about, assassinating your leaders, spying on you, listening to your stuff, bringing you up on charges, whatever. And recuperation, right, is about in the face of your social movement's critiques, getting us all to come back and participate in the system as it is, right? So that's kind of what I want to think about. My big question that I've been struggling with this semester and been really fascinated as I read the different readings for the class to kind of look at like, what is this author saying? What is this author saying? Is how do we figure out, is this tactic or reform or approach recuperating systems and institutions that we want to dismantle, right? When we face this mainstream moment, suddenly there's a million reforms being suggested around trans politics or around the criminal punishment systems. And you've got, I got this email from like the Brennan Center that was like, prosecutors and sheriffs all around the country are getting together to solve the racism in the criminal system. I'm like, oh, I guess our job is over. We all can go watch TV because they've got it. Like that kind of recuperation, that like, we've got it, we've got your critique, we're gonna, co-opt your language and you guys can just go to sleep. It's cool. Which produces mainstream reforms, which produce no, material changes for people, right? So we have asked this question every time we're dealing with reform, because we're always thinking about possible reforms, right? What do we want? How do we get it? What are the short-term solutions towards the long-term solutions? We have to ask this question. How do we tell if it's recuperating a system or institution that we're trying to dismantle? Here's a comic that I think is funny about this. This is just like a really plain example of this, right? The U.S. military, it's a really liberating space for women, LGBT people. Do you guys know? It's like that, right? What the fuck? Okay. So for years, I've been using a set of criteria. For people who have read my book, I've talked about this there. I've been using a set of criteria for how I think about this question, which I'll briefly go over. You won't be surprised. Does it provide material relief, right? So like, is this thing going to actually get people better life chances? Is anybody going to get housing? Is anybody going to get more food? Is anybody, right? Is it going to stop some kind of violence happening? Or is it just window dressing? Does it leave out an especially marginalized part of the affected group? So is it like only for people with, with no criminal record, or only for people who have immigration status, right? Because inevitably a lot of these reforms do that deserving, undeserving. I think that undermines our power and causes us to participate in the extreme further marginalization of the most marginalized groups already within a particular constituency. And it's divisive and terrible for our movements. Does it legitimize or expand a system we're trying to dismantle? And does it mobilize the most affected for an ongoing struggle? So sometimes we're interested in short-term reform struggles, even though we know they have limited results because of the process itself. So I'll give you an example of this, which I wrote about a little bit in my book, which is this process that I was involved in for a long period of time in New York City, where we were trying to address the extreme transphobia in the welfare system there. So the welfare administration in New York City is called the Human Resources Administration. And there's just a million ways that trans people get screwed over there who are on welfare. Like you get kicked out of the welfare office when you're trying to apply, or when you're supposed to show up for your workfare job assignment because they say that you were in the wrong bathroom and you're bad, or they say you're not dressed ready for work because you're not dressed in the gendered clothing they think you should be. People's, food stamps cards and other things don't have the right name and gender marker on them, and then they're denied. There's just a million things. So a bunch of us wrote kind of a best practices document for HRA and tried to push that through. And there was an organizing process that was organized by and for the current trans people on welfare, right? And it was mostly Black trans women. And so they were doing this organizing, and ultimately what they won was a really small part of the best practices. And they also made these cards for people to hand out to their friends and carry in wallets and bring to welfare offices that are these are the rights we won for you and you should know. Everybody in that organizing process knew that this wasn't going to lead HRA to treat people good, right? The point of HRA is to kill poor people. That is it, right? That is the point of HRA. But the process of organizing it together, building power, building the leadership skills of people in that group, this incredibly hated group, trans welfare recipients, right? A very marginalized group, even inside the LGBT world, very, very marginalized group of people, right? Those people all continued to be leaders. While they were winning this policy, they also knew it wasn't the answer. It wasn't like they thought it was the end all be all. It was a process which led to their increased political leadership on lots of other anti-poverty campaigns in the city that changed the status of trans people in some of those campaigns and allowed trans leaders to integrate more into other anti-poverty campaigns. It produced relationships and transformation and leadership that has a long-term impact that we can't even know all the impacts of, right? So it wasn't the narrow reform, which we all know is inadequate, wasn't the only goal, right? It was this really multiple complex process that transforms the movement, right? So that's another piece of this. That's why that's a very long thing. Okay, so this semester I'm thinking about these other people and what are their criteria, and one of them is this guy, Peter Gelder. Maybe people at Evergreen know who he is. Do you guys read him? Because whenever I go, people are like, who's that? He's not an academic. He's an independent scholar, like anarchist guy he wrote a book called How Nonviolence Protects the State that I've often taught. It came out around 2005 and it has some really great arguments in it. It's very readable, short, like really straightforward. I love it. And then this year, 2015, he kind of produced like an updated version called The Failure of Nonviolence. And a lot of his argument is about why we shouldn't fetishize particular tactics, like such as pacifist tactics. We should have a diversity of tactics as an argument. But one of the things he does in the new book is he looks at all these recent revolutionary moments, like the Egyptian Revolution, Occupy Wall Street, the M15 movement in Spain, just like different things. And he says, like, how do we tell if something's liberatory? And he created these criteria. I was like, this is fascinating to see his criteria of what he thinks, how we should evaluate an approach or a form or an effort to see if it's liberatory. His first question is, does it see space in which new social relations can be enacted? And he looks a lot at stuff like, did they have general assemblies? Did people come together and make decisions in ways they weren't used to? Like when I think about like Occupy in the United States, it had different like complications and limitations in lots of places. But for most of my students, it was the first time they ever saw or heard of people making a decision as a group where there was no boss, parent, owner. Like the idea of making a decision by consensus, which maybe isn't too wild at Evergreen, is like really wild in the United States. It's like most people have never experienced it. So that's like a seizing of new social relations. But Gelder is also talking about when people seize space. People, people occupying land, people occupying buildings, people squatting housing, people taking over space, people feeding each other, people providing healthcare, doing all this stuff outside of the kind of, industrialized, racist, harmful, deadly institutions in which we're supposed to get that stuff. So that's also what he's talking about. So seizing new social relations. I think that's an really interesting criteria. Does it spread awareness of its ideas? For him, it's really important that this not just be like, oh yeah, I've heard of it, but that people like took it on and participated in it, right? So Black Lives Matter, like people start their own chapters where they live. It's not like they're just like, oh yes, I've heard the slogan. It's like, no, people like do stuff about it, right? Which is really different than kind of consuming or like armchair idea awareness. Does it have elite support? I mean, this one I think is really interesting. He says, if part of the elite supports a movement, it is much more likely that that movement appears to achieve victories when in fact that victory is insubstantial and supports elite interests. I think that's really, really interesting for us because so much of kind of the most domesticated social movement work is about trying to get elites to support it. So he's asking something to me that's very fascinating there. And does it achieve any concrete gains in improving people's lives? So kind of back to the material support piece. Then I also wanted to look at Harsha Walia. She is the author of a book called Undoing Border Imperialism, which I highly recommend. She's part of No One is Illegal in Vancouver. And No One is Illegal, has like chapters across Canada and does all of this anti-border work and all this deep Indigenous solidarity work. And she asks, has the tactic been effective in exposing or confronting a specific point within the system by either diminishing its moral legitimacy or undermining its functions? One of the things she writes about in her book is No One is Illegal Vancouver, organized with a bunch of other groups, and there was this guy named Libar Singh, and he was going to be deported at Vancouver Airport, and 2,000 people showed up at Vancouver Airport and shut down the international terminal, blocked the van from having Libar Singh go into the airport, and he wasn't deported that day. So she's, undermining its functions. She's talking about very direct action responses to things like deportation, which I think is very interesting. So she's interested in both how our work can name and identify harmful systems and undermine their moral legitimacy. So like avoid them getting like pinkwashed or whitewashed or greenwashed or any of that, but also how we can literally stop the mechanisms, right? Which I think is a really cool criteria. I also was thinking about critical resistance, kind of, one of the leading abolitionist organizations in the United States over the last couple decades. One quote from two organizers from critical resistance is, "We reject reforms that reorient and prolong the life of the PIC." And for years, I've been in conversation with people from critical resistance who basically have said, we ask the question, will it expand the system that we're trying to dismantle, and will we have to undo this later, right? So anything that's going to build another wing on the prison, or add more staff to the prison, or legitimize the prison so it lasts longer, right? So that's a really interesting question, right? Like, I don't know if you guys, how much this discourse is reaching you here in Olympia, but in Seattle, the Seattle Police Department's been under investigation by the DOJ for its like racism and murders and all that. It has a crisis of legitimacy, in my opinion. Seattle Prosecutor's Office, desperate for its legitimacy, always trying to present itself as liberal and progressive by saying it saves women and having a lot of discourse about human trafficking. That's unbelievable. But one of the things that Seattle prosecutors and the King County Prosecutor's Office is doing is nationally it's known for its diversion programs. So it's like you get arrested and something else happens instead of going to court. If you like comply and you go to this class and you do this stuff, then you can not go to court. And so this is designed to prolong the life of the PIC, right? Prolong the life of the prosecutor's office by creating like this softer solution. It's still based in all the same shit. Like, who's going to get arrested? Why should you have to get arrested to go to a class about whatever? How does this, it keeps the same numbers or more police on the streets. It keeps the same prosecutors in business, right? But it's a framework that sounds really good. It's like, oh, the King County Prosecutor's Office, they're so progressive, right? So you can watch like these kinds of reforms that are about like expanding the system or maintaining it in the face of criticism, right? And then Miriam Kaba, I'm sure some of you have read her work from Project NIA in Chicago. She's talking about reforms to the police. She asks, does it allocate more money to the police? Obviously, then we shouldn't do it. Does it advocate for more police or policing? So is it like, let's hire, like I think Seattle, someone told me recently that SPD is like playing this thing where they're gonna like hire some women of color to like be police officers who like come and like help resolve conflict on the street. You know what I mean? Like it's just like, it's the same. It's like hire more police, right? And tokenize people and all that. Is the reform primarily technology focused? She says basically, technology always needs more money to the police, and technology is more likely to be turned against the public than it is used against the cops. And we're not going to solve the white supremacy of policing with technology. And then she asks, is it focused on individual dialogues with individual cops? Because this, she's worried, is like a debate about bad apples, right? The whole, like, there's just those few bad police who kill people, instead of understanding, like, the entire history of policing is a history of the maintenance of white supremacy and the murder of black people, and the idea of individual dialogues. And she's also like, and we're gonna use taxpayer money to like have these false individual dialogues with individual cops? Like, absolutely not. So I think her criteria are also interesting for looking at this. So to me, I'll just end with saying, like, I've made like a kind of short list of just some of the kinds of reforms I can imagine us debating using some of this criteria, right? Because the thing about a social movement is like, it's not like we have the answer. It's not like these criteria get you there. You then still have arguments. You're still like, I think it could work. And the other person's like, no, what would this happen? Because we don't know what's going to happen, right? And something that worked last year, now they've got like a counter move and it doesn't work anymore. And it's actually really harmful and hurts our communities. We don't know. So to me, I'm not trying to say that this is like the silver bullet. It's like, I just want us to get to the place where we even have these conversations instead of the place where we're like, oh my God, they named our group in law. Yay, trans people are free because we were part of the Hate Crimes Act now. That's what we're being sold, right? So we have a lot of work to do to kind of come through that to these very pragmatic, actual, difficult debates. So some of the things I think we could debate. The decriminalization of drugs, sex work, or anything else. For a long time, I've just been like, that's obviously what we should do. We should decriminalize stuff. Living here in Washington State, where we've decriminalized marijuana, I also can't help but notice that like the entire recreational marijuana industry is owned by white people, that it's part of gentrification of the Central District in Seattle, that people of color are still criminalized for things that white people are no longer criminalized for. So there's a lot of questions we have to ask about decriminalization frameworks. The story doesn't end with decriminalization. How could decriminalization frameworks actually continue to reinforce the status quo of racism? Right, and anti-poor policing and all that stuff. So, and I hear these things also about people who study places where sex work has been decriminalized, and sometimes that means that people are, in some kind of legalized arrangement run by the state that involves like lower wages, really bad working conditions. So we really need to ask, like, what are the conditions under which decriminalization or legalization are happening, and are those conditions of self-determination and anything that we could call freedom or liberatory? Or are they just bringing us into other ways that we're going to be regulated by sexist and racist markets? Civilian review boards, hot topic right now, right? Like, is this a way to rein in the police? And people are asking a lot of questions like, do they have the power to fire cops? And do they have the power to punish cops? And what would make them have teeth? Or do none of them work at all? Or are they just window dressing for the policing system because there's a place to complain where nothing will happen? I mean, these are really big questions. A lot of research is being done and needs to be done about, like, you know, when they're more effective, when they're less effective, if they're effective. So that's the kind of thing I think we could really debate, maybe using some of this criteria. Another really hard one, queer and trans units in jails and prisons, right? A lot of places have had, especially a lot of men's facilities for years have had like a queen's tank or a place where queer and trans people are placed when they enter a men's facility. And in a lot of places, people feel that those are very dangerous parts of the facility, or more dangerous or more restrictive in various ways, or you have less time outside, or you can't access certain kinds of programming if you're in there. And other places people feel like those are safer or have been, you know, somehow relieving. And so that's who decides who gets to go in there? There's some really interesting research about that. So that's a really big question. Like, are these a strategy that is useful or harmful to queer and trans people entering these systems? Reforms that funnel people into other systems of racialized incarceration or control. One of the really big dilemmas whenever you have conversations about prison abolition is people are like, yeah, those people are just mentally ill and they should just be put in a psychiatric facility instead. That's also a prison. We need to be really connected to disability justice activists' articulations of medicalized and psychiatric prisons as prisons, and also often prisons that have a kind of like endless discretion about keeping people. So just really thinking carefully about any reforms that replace one prison with another. Or, I mean, this is the same deal too. Like, we'll get kids out of adult prison and put them in kids' prisons. You know, like, that's just more prison. Proposals for softer punishment, so things like the diversion programs I was talking about, or alternative sentencing, or special courts like drug courts, mental health courts, some places have prostitution courts. You know, these courts that are supposed to be like for this social problem. So you still had to like be arrested, basically be kidnapped by the state, experience all that trauma to end up in this court where supposedly you're gonna get social services, but if you like mess up at all or don't show up for one of your meetings or, you know, have one positive drug test, then you're like back in court with the same ramifications, right? So a lot of these, I think, expand the criminal punishment system, are, you know, kind of designed to fail for the people going through them, justify the ongoing arrest and harassment of the same populations. You know, ankle monitoring, right? All these things, you know, ankle monitoring, like you have to pay for it when you have ankle monitoring, like all these things that are like technological solutions that are often expanding budgets. And you know, similar to like the body cameras, I saw this amazing presentation recently about how the body cameras for cops are made by the same companies that make like the less lethal weapons, like the taser and stuff, and their stocks like went through the roof when Black Lives Matter started. Like, there's people getting rich off these reforms, right? Like, we got to be suspicious of that, you know? And another one, this is always like really controversial for me to say in very academic spaces. I don't know what you guys will think, who are more critical, but data collection. You know, one of the things you always hear is we just need more data. How many trans people are there? You know, how many of them are in prison? And I have a few concerns about this. One is that I think that data collection usually involves constituting populations. Like, researchers pretend that they're discovering or just counting populations, but actually they're inventing populations based on particular norms. So that how are trans people being defined in this study? And oftentimes it's like a definition that's really messed up and will like leave out a lot of people and not actually get at the question we're trying to get at. And also, I'm concerned because I think sometimes this call comes because you go and you sit down with, you know, some person in power and you say, you've got to do something about this horrible thing that's happening in our community. And they say, if only you had more data. And it's a lie. It's not true. If you come back with data, they're still not going to do anything. Like, the only thing that makes people do anything is like a massive social movement. Like, it's you know, we know what's happening in our communities. And so the idea that we don't know and that like, but are enough people being raped? I mean, that's not an acceptable, you know, like that's that's what goes on in that conversation, you know? And so obviously like everybody, we all are engaged in different kinds of data collection and research, and especially community research is really meaningful. And it's really meaningful the kinds of work people do to like reach out to people in prisons and hear about their experiences directly and all of that. I'm not against collecting information, but I'm worried about like data collection as this like call. And especially in recent years, there's been this call to like put queer and trans people on the census and put us on the tobacco studies and all these things. And there's been an enormous amount of data produced about us that I think is very, very sketchy and is often really framed to push for recuperating reforms. I recently published an article about this. If you're interested in this kind of critique of statistical methods piece, it's online. It's in the journal The Scholar and The Feminist, and it's called something about like gay numbers. And we look at the Williams Institute, which is a think tank at UCLA, and they produce all this data about LGBT people, and a lot of it's used like in courts and like in decisions and stuff. And it's really sketchy data that's designed to make LGBT people look like it's like gay marriage will make your state rich. Like it's stuff like that, you know. Gay people are good adoptive parents because they're rich, you know, like just things that are like really along white racist norms that really reproduce those frameworks that tend to undercount trans people, that tend to leave out and sideline the actual experiences of poor LGBT people and people of color. So I think there's a lot there for us to be kind of concerned about data collection. And then I just have a pretty picture to look at while we talk about it.